hasn't snowed in a while.
You got the little pen holder.
Just slutting. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Can't.
Yeah, no, don't do it.
No, yeah.
Dude,
I should have drawn this backwards, but too late now.
Nuts, right?
Yeah, it has been.
You can put it upside down. It might make us.
There you go.
Yeah.
Keep us on our toes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get started.
All right, let's get started. Okay, so the title of this talk has actually changed because I was so stimulated by the talks yesterday. This is partly a response, but also a bit of a redistillation of some work I've been doing over the last 2 years on both information theoretic accounts of trust, as well as how the contingencies of physical embodiment can create the capacity to handle open-endedness, to generalize essentially, and to provide care, which is a paper we just submitted to Science Robotics, sort of how to align artificial agents based on Heideggerian and Nietzschean principles. So this talk is kind of, I guess I would call an information theoretic recapitulation of God through will to power, embodiment, multi-scale empowerment, trust, and self-transcendence. So, we begin with what are the conditions of physical embodiment, the conditions of being in the world. And they are several. One is being in the world, which I'm used to talking to these things with people who study reinforcement learning, so making those legible to them. And one way to think about being in the world is that the agent is part of the world that they are affecting, right? The agent, if there's a world that is characterized by states, the self is not platonically distinct from those states, but is itself a subset of the states of the world. And this is important because it also implies in some ways the property of non-duality, that you cannot, there's no true intrinsic separation between self and world, and which is important. This actually is a source of, will become a source of care and consolation. Another property is, we take inspiration from Heidegger, but not considered truly isomorphic, is being towards death, which is the fact that in the environment there are absorbing states from which one cannot emerge, states from which there is no escape regardless of what one does, and that by virtue of entropy, by virtue of the second law of thermodynamics, whereby entropy at the global scale is always increasing and can only be reduced locally, that by virtue of that, not only do absorbing terminal states exist, but we are all irrevocably drifting towards them at all times, and hence must act to avoid those terminal states at all time. And so, if you can almost think of terminal states as, if you can almost think of, there's state space, you can almost think of terminal states as black holes, the black hole. We are always curving and always going towards it, and all we can do is constantly veer away and veer away and veer away, right? Which also implies the existence of something like an event horizon, right? Points at which no amount of action, no amount of energy or action can avert oneself from falling into the black hole to which we are all destined. And because of these two properties, effectively, one is in the world that is subject to entropy and is always drifting towards terminal states, one requires an intrinsic drive to avoid it. This is where the will, you can argue that from an information theoretic standpoint or epistemic standpoint or agentic standpoint, the will to power there emerges. There needs to be anything that has come to persist in the world under these conditions of embodiment must have an intrinsic drive to be constantly expanding its empowerment, which I will describe empowerment in information theoretic terms in just a second, because it's an extremely useful construct. But before I do so, there's one more really, really crucial property. And what I'll argue is that given these things are true, or given these conditions, that we can arrive at almost a recapitulation of God, or what God is functionally. But this last property is open-endedness. Basically, that when anticipating or calculating or predicting or modeling the future states at any time horizon is one of a particular kind of uncertainty. One is that's known as Nietzschean uncertainty, which is to say an uncertainty of which we do not know the shape. And to illustrate what that is, A non-Knightian or typical like a frequentist uncertainty would be, for example, a die, a six-faced die. When you throw a die, you know, even though you don't know what number you're going to get, you do know that it will be one of 6 numbers. It will only be one number. And provided the die is reasonably a fair die, there's an equal probability of any of those 1 numbers coming up. Therefore, you can derive a distribution. Your uncertainty about the die has a distribution. So you can make assumptions about the shape of that uncertainty. However, and so you could think of that as first order uncertainty, like, right, just what's going to happen. I don't know what's going to happen, but then there's a second order uncertainty, which is what is the shape of that uncertainty, and that can be either shaped, as in this case, or Gaussian noise is a frequent one that you can apply to many systems. Is used a lot in linear, like in a lot of linear calculations, but the world, the environment, I would argue, presents a particular type of uncertainty called Knightian uncertainty. It is one of which we do not know the structure. To give the example of the die again, the form of uncertainty posed by the world and the states of it is as if you had a die that you didn't know how many sides it has. It can put up more than one side when you roll it, and you don't know the weights given to each side. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So it's not just that you don't know what's going to happen, but you don't even have a structured anticipation of what's going to happen in most senses. And so attempting to counter this unstructured uncertainty is something that, for example, people who have been trying to renovate reinforcement learning to attempt to give AIs something akin to the open-ended intelligence that we have. Part of what people like Joel Lehman, a collaborator of mine, has argued is that we have to account for this form of uncertainty. And to do so, they oddly enough come to a very Nietzschean and Heideggerian conclusion that you need agents that are continually learning. You need agents that are intrinsically driven to satisfy drives that are not extrinsic. Because if you try to optimize for a specific type of reward, if the rules are always changing of the game, you will inevitably fail. So this is why extrinsic or instrumental reward schema are inherently brittle. They don't last well in the long term. Long-term persistence and flourishing in these types of environments where you don't even know the structure of the uncertainty requires an intrinsic drive. And it turns out that the will to power, as you might formalize it via information theoretic empowerment, is a really good candidate intrinsic drive. So empowerment basically can be defined here. Don't worry about the symbols, it's just a useful thing, but essentially that empowerment is another way of saying what is the shared information between your actions and your future states. And that shared information is encompassed by 2 things. It's the diversity of states, the entropy of the states possible in the future, minus the entropy or the uncertainty presented by how your current actions and your current expectations map onto future states. So you can think of empowerment and the maximization of empowerment as one way of thinking about will to power in agentic information theoretic terms, which is another way of saying what I'm always trying to do, what beings are always trying to do that have learned to live in this open-ended world for billions of years, is we're trying to maximize the number of future states and options we have and our ability to control those future states. And what's cool about empowerment is that not only is it a great candidate intrinsic drive for describing how agents work, but it's also actually it makes for a really good what's called utility function. It makes for a really good thing if you're trying to orient an agent or a person and you're telling them, and they ask you, hey, what's the rule about how I should treat others, how I should regard others? Turns out a really good one is to say, well, just optimize for their empowerment. Try to make sure that all the beings you come into contact with, try to help them have as many options to persist in the future on their own terms, and that they have maximal control over those options. And the reason why that's a very nice utility function, for example, for aligning AI or any other kind of agents, is because one of my colleagues, Adam Safran, calls it a formalization of love, in that you don't just want things to do well, you want things to do well in a manner in which they have autonomy and self-efficacy and agency, right? You could imagine that an AI that was simply told, okay, you're super intelligent and all powerful, I want you to make everything. I want you to make everything just do well, to be healthy. And it's like, well, great. I'll make everyone unconscious. I'll just hook everyone up, just tube up the butt, tube in the mouth, tube the thing, and they'll have all their needs met in perpetuity. And it's like, and you're like, yeah, but then what about their autonomy? What about their sense that they have control and some agency in this setting? And it's like, well, you didn't ask me to do that. And so empowerment offers a very nice, I think, utility function for doing that. And the cool thing is that you can actually define the Heideggerian conditions of the world in terms of this really nice, very simple information theoretical construct, in the sense that being in the world, right, this selfhood, you can define, which is actually, I think, a more coherent way of thinking about the self. You can define the self, in a sense, in terms of its schema of control, right? And right, that, you know, if I am not just me, I am also the things over which I have some reliable form of agency, right? Like, and this extends to tools, this extends to even my networks of trust, the people in my life with whom I coordinate in order to, you know, inhabit parts of state space that we couldn't inhabit alone. In some ways, when doing so, when I trust someone in that way and I coordinate with them, we're now jointly empowering one another. We are becoming a kind of hyper agent among ourselves. And I would argue that the boundaries of the affective self in this sense are malleable. They are not fixed. They are not, there is no a priori delineation of the self here. And if that doesn't make sense, because you're going like, well, you're just talking about, you know, collective, but, you know, clearly this is one coherent self. And I would say, well, not really. I mean, if you're looking at, you know, if you look at early motor learning, if you look at the development of infants, a big part of what they are doing, just like we learn to trust people in order to form relationships, is they are doing movements and trying to refine this loop of what I intend to do is what actually happens, right? They're trying to maximize their own empowerment. And you can imagine how quickly, and this is something attested to by people who have, say, Capgras syndrome, phantom hand syndrome, or people who have severe problems with addiction, the more that something you perceived to be of self begins to now no longer map, its future states start to no longer map onto your intentions and your actions about them, the more they start to feel like separate from you, non-self, the more that a part of you does not in any way fit your predictions, your hopes and expectations, it starts to kind of individuate itself. And this is one of the scary things about, you know, you could argue the body as it ages, is that it starts to decohere again. And efficacy and agency decreases to the point where you now are perhaps inhabiting an environment over which you have very little agency and control, right? And you can think of being towards death can be defined in the same way, and in a very simple state, that absorbing are terminal states, right? The states that all mortal beings are guided towards can be thought of as just ones of zero empowerment, right? Ones in which there are no diversities of future states available, and there is no control over them. And this is always increasing, basically. So then what then is the way to think of the self, and how does it relate? I think usefully, though again, I'm not an expert on Nietzsche or Heidegger or Buddhism or information theory. So I'm really open to critiques on these things. I'm a neuroscientist. But that one can think of the self in a way as a process of multi-scale empowerment, right? And what I mean about that is that much of what was being talked about in terms of the relationship between will and then the relationship between will and suffering, or will and valence, can be thought of in this fashion. Basically, you could think of the self as engaging in different temporal scales of estimation of its empowerment, right? Going from, you could think about for a time scale 0, this is almost like the pure moment, the pure self, pure self-focused awareness, no counterfactual assessment of the future or the past, kind of like a single point awareness state, is one that I think, not unsurprisingly, is one that is often equated as a practice for death. Because it is a simulation of an absorbing state, a simulation of a terminal state that is nonetheless accessible with difficulty in life. But it's one that you could be argued deep within this multi-scale self, there is a part of you that is just inhabiting moment to moment to moment with no counterfactual depth. But that's not the only part of you, right? It couldn't be the only part of you, unless you were a really adept meditator or in some sort of coma state. Because, you know, what's interesting about that kind of state where it's a perfect closed loop is that, true, there's no loss of empowerment being registered. There's also no gain in empowerment being registered. Essentially, there is no empowerment being defined whatsoever. So that's a state of non-valence in a way, right? As soon as you now expand it across time, and let's take the minimal time interval, just the smallest amount of time in advance that we can be planning any kind of behavior, even just like this, right? The smallest one, that's a small time loop where, you know, you could, when you guys were describing The Last Man, it was reminding me much of this. The Last Man is this agent that is calculating, it's estimating its maximum, it's empowerment, but over this very, very, very small time window. So it's not considering, you know, 2 steps ahead, 3 steps ahead, 4 steps ahead. It's just like right now, just in this one minimal time moment, you know, just in this time moment, there's basically a high assurance of some empowerment, but then also there's not very far down that it can go, right? So you could argue that, you know, the last man both is less subject to the suffering that comes from apprehending the possibility of terminal states, of absorbing states, because it's not considering long time horizons. But you could argue that is also one. Wow. You could also,
this is pretty heavy. So
okay, you could argue that last, this sort of like minimal self, this last man within the self, is also one that its well-being is very brittle, because it's not situated in any larger scale of meaning, right? Part of, you know, this something that I forget who said it, but it's been described many times in meditative practices, is that there are 2 arrows, right? There are 2 forms of suffering, 2 layers of suffering. The first is simply the dissatisfaction of a desire or a prediction. Something didn't go the way you wanted on any scale, and that's the first. But then the second sort of form of suffering is when that disappointment, when that failure to fulfill a desire or an error in one's predictions about what's going to happen occurs. It's also, what is the place of that within the larger horizon of time and meaning that one is considering, right? And this is why long time horizons provide meaning, and part of what meaning provides is a buffer against the forms of suffering caused by suffering, essentially, right? Like if I am feeling pain today, but I'm part of a structure of meaning that encompasses the week, such as exercise, well, then it's okay. I don't have the second arrow. I don't suffer in the same way, because you could argue that the second form of suffering is the more pernicious one, because it implies that something about the world itself is wrong. It implies I wish that this were not the case. And to wish that things are other than they are, to fail to accept them, is a much deeper form of suffering than any momentary pain. But it's one that only comes from entertaining long time horizons and structures of meaning. When you have a large structure of meaning in which your suffering is nonetheless not validated and not given meaning, that is a deep form of suffering, right? Such as to lose your faith in God, right? Or lose your faith in something very deep and long. And you could think of, on a much longer time horizon, like let's say contemplating the inevitability of death, that now that self would probably be more akin to this suicidal nihilist, right? It's the contemplation of a point or a time horizon over which my empowerment will decrease to 0. I will no longer be able, there's a point I can anticipate that I cannot escape at all. And, you know, you could argue that how does one confront that? And that the confronting of that is a necessary point in maturation. Now, what I would argue here is that something which I really agree with what was discussed yesterday about the suicidal nihilist and or the suffering nihilist in The Last Man, that from an epistemic, from virtually any perspective by which we would rate some kind of agent, epistemically and otherwise, the suffering or the suicidal nihilist is superior to the last man, right? Because even though they are suffering, and there's a greater capacity there's a great possibility for a greater depth of suffering. I feel like this is somehow appropriate. The thing that must be maintained that inevitably falls.
It's that little bottom thing. If you put the
it's a
arrows
real
on
it's
either
a
side,
it's a real
then
fucker.
it'll stay.
Yeah.
So you just put the other peacock on the other side.
Oh, there we go. No, I think that's it. Okay. So I would argue that I agree that the suicidal or the suffering nihilist is epistemically superior to the last man, in that yes, they have greater capacity. They do have greater capacity for the potential suffering by virtue of that degree of suffering being tied to the degree of perceived empowerment over some time horizon. But I would also argue that their suffering, that is not complete maturation. That it is fertile ground and necessary ground, but that the suicidal nihilist, when viewed this way, and again, I'm borrowing terms that I don't know very well just from these conversations, but that it rests on false premises. It rests on a delusion ultimately, and this is probably where more Buddhist types ideas come into the fray. And what I would argue, that given Nietzschean uncertainty, given that there is radical uncertainty about the future and radical uncertainty about even the shape of that uncertainty, and because, especially for any time horizon, as you go towards infinity, that the Nietzschean uncertainty is almost infinite, that I would make the argument that if you take the sum over all time horizons of empowered states versus the sum over a time horizon of absorbing states or mortal terminal states, the empowered states always outnumber the terminal states, always. And why? Because if you're thinking about time as it goes along here, right, and think about the vertical axis is empowerment, right, and the line is the sort of the event horizon. If you fall below, you cannot come back, right? But here you can continue. That as time proceeds from moment to moment, yes, there's the possibility here of maybe, an empowered state which has future options, or a non-empowered state. Great. So there's that absorbing one. And here, let's say there's even just one and one, there's parity. But as soon as you go to the next time point, that empowered state, by its definition, implies that there are multiple states that branch off from it. And maybe some of those are, again, terminal or absorbing states. But if you consider this progression, the empowered states, by their definition, keep branching and branching and branching, such that if you sum this over virtually any time horizon that means anything, the empowered states, the states from which there is some escape, always outnumber the absorbing states, the terminal states. Hence, when accounting over some horizon, when playing the part of this potential suicidal nihilist, to make the estimate, your estimation can always safely be on the side of the fact that there will be some way out, that there will be some way to overcome some perceived absorbing state, simply by virtue of the fact that even though there is this radical uncertainty, you can more or less be confident that the number of states that offer you some escape, that offer you furtherance and persistence of yourself, outnumber the ones that do not over a given time horizon. And you might say, well, yeah, but what about death, right? Well, first of all, because of the aforementioned Nietzschean uncertainty, you don't know when it's going to happen, right? And what all there is our, what we do while alive, while alive, and therefore, this form of estimation is simply a better prior on the basis of which to exist. It is better to assume that there will be ways out, because the doing so also engenders a state, an empowered state, that itself furthers that sort of behavior. That is to say, it's inactive. If I take as my assumption that I will find ways out, I am more likely to find ways out, right? So it entails a kind of an epistemic justification for bravery. It entails an epistemic justification for having trust in having trust in the universe, to having trust in the future in some capacity, by virtue of the fact that you can be very confident that the states from which there is an escape outnumber the ones that don't. And that if you do enter the terminal state, well, in that terminal state, the loop is zero. There's no suffering to be had. So, what why be this suicidal nihilist, right? And you might argue, well, why not? And it's like, yes, I agree. You could just end it. But I think there's this additional aspect to this empowerment view of agents, which is the notion of trust. So trust is a very interesting property, I think, of agentic systems, because trust can be thought of here essentially as the estimation of joint empowerment, right? So if empowerment here is the diversity of my future states conditioned on my control over those future states, you can think of trust actually as the estimation, if I'm talking about trusting Tao or trusting any system, my trust is essentially my estimation of an attempt to maximize the future states that we can inhabit together, and the fidelity between our respective cues that we offer, our behaviors, our words, our promises, our deeds, and the fidelity between those and our joint states together, right? If I trust you, I trust that when you say, I will see you tomorrow at 3 p.m., that you will see me tomorrow at 3 p.m., right? There's a fidelity between your current cues and future actions. So essentially that's what my other work essentially describes, is trust as relational empowerment. And what's interesting about that is that by virtue of this notion of self as being in the world, self as a variably assessed, schema of control, what arises from that, as I was describing from the example of motor learning, how as the infant grows and gets into better control loops over it's not just its limbs, but its language, its tools, etc., the control scheme of self expands. The self expands essentially through maturation. And I would argue that it expands relationally through trust, not just to encompass, even the body and the skin and the tools, but to encompass others. Those who we trust, those systems who we trust, about whom we assume high fidelity between their current cues and future states, are ones that we can argue now form part of the self. They are, if the self is a variable control schema, the extent to which I have this virtual control, this extension of my agency via others, via trusted others, then myself also expands. And this may be how will to power, which is often thought of, I think, wrongly as purely selfish, as a desire for dominance, etc. In fact, that this intrinsic drive, this will to power, is in fact the basis for robust, enduring, and context invariant care for others. It is actually a basis for aligning. It's a basis for alignment, because as our control schema of self expands through those that are aligned with us, reliable, trustworthy, and trusted, and with whom we coordinate, that we also now seek to empower, because as that is our intrinsic drive, our will to power now extends to empower others, extends to empower those who form part of this extended self. And this, I would argue, is one of the potential solutions to the problem of inevitable mortality, in that as we have relationships, as we have children, as we have students, as we have projects that transcend the temporal bounds of this thing that we initially were deluded into thinking was our only self, right? The self formed by motor control on these things. As that occurs, the time horizon along which we can calculate our empowerment, along which dictates the sort of the level of meaning and suffering and non-suffering that we experience, that time horizon now extends beyond our death, right? And that's why it's not accidental that forming part of something greater than oneself is historically considered the greatest balm against egoic, egotistical suffering. When you decide on the basis of these steps of inference to seek to empower all things, to seek to empower all sentient beings, to seek to empower things beyond yourself in a growing circle of concern, it apports a level of meaning, and hence, as we said before, a level of a buffer against suffering that is immeasurable, right? And provides, I think, a more enduring rationale for bravery. And so what I would argue is that if you extend this same trust schema, right, of aggregation into hyperagents, and you extend that to infinity, you essentially arrive at this relational empowerment when extended to an infinite time horizon, I would argue is equivalent to God. It is a recapitulation of God, because it is a relationship with a structure of meaning within which all other things can be given a meaning, within which all activities and all states and all things that occur can have a meaning. It is one with which it is a hyperagent with which one, technically speaking, forms part. So you are part of this thing that encompasses all things. It is on an infinite time horizon. Within it, all things are given meaning. Within it, all suffering is relative and part of a larger scheme. And furthermore, a very important aspect of trust that this brings in, you could argue that trust, infinite trust, or trust on infinite time horizons, is equivalent to faith. Because a really important aspect of trust, which I should mention, because sometimes people call it trust as extended control, and I don't think that's quite the case. Because what I do when I trust you, for example, in the example I gave before, if I trust that you will come, that I'll meet you tomorrow at 3 p.m. Implicit in that, especially if I trust you deeply, and this actually is one way we talk about the depth of trust. Implicit of that is that I'm not going to check how you get there. I'm not going to monitor and make sure that you get dressed, that you get your car, that you think, and that you're going to arrive on time if I trust you deeply. I just trust that future event will happen. I am agnostic, in fact, to the trajectories that lead up to it. I do not feel a need to control them, which also is part of what makes trust calming. When you can successfully place your trust in something, it is one of the most calming, deeply relaxing states that any agent can enter into, when you feel that you can actually place trust in something. Part of that, from a homeostatic perspective, is that you are greatly reducing the anticipated metabolic cost of monitoring and verifying and checking. And if that's not clear, contrast it with the case of an agent or assistant that you do not trust, but that you nonetheless rely on, that your joint states are conditioned upon. It is one of the most pernicious and oldest forms of stress and suffering that exists within the human condition. There's a reason why in Dante's depiction of the Inferno, the lowest circle of hell is reserved for whom? Does anyone remember? Not murderers, not thieves. Who's it reserved for? Traitors. Traitors. The betrayal of trust is considered in many ontologies as the fundamental sin. It is the greatest. It's the worst thing that can happen to anything, is to be deeply betrayed, right? And so, taking the positive version of that, how basically it's the trust, it's the faith in a future outcome without feeling the need to check and control the ways in which it gets there. Trust over an infinite time horizon essentially is this notion that, like, the universe will the system will keep systeming, and I do not need to check and control that is the case, and I can relax about that fact, and I can relax in a way in being part of this hyper agent that I am in fact part of. So in this way, you can see how it begins to, from this purely epistemic perspective, begins to recapitulate much of what I think we value about God and about faith, and what people often miss by having a faith, by having a great ontology in which all behaviors and all actions make sense. They're all part of the plan, that notion. But the only thing you get to there, so just to summarize it, is my argument is, if you take the proposition of being in the world, of being towards death, of 19 of certainty, if the self does in fact expand via trust, and trust is essentially relational empowerment, then trust over an infinite time horizon, or infinite spatial temporal horizon, is equivalent to faith, and that cultivating this sort of trust in all things, in that 19 uncertainty itself, is a useful homeostatic kind of bootstrapping. It's good for organisms to cultivate a sense of trust in some instantiation of all things, whether it's a little totem, or whether, as many people call it, the universe, that is not, even whether or not you give it any ontological form, it is a valid epistemic tool and a perspective to have that motivates bravery, and gives succor to in the face of the vicissitudes of life. Now, but you might further argue, and this is a final point that actually responded to Dulcinea, which is like, well, what sort of God is this? This God of Nietzschean uncertainty. And I would argue, and this is, I think, coherent, that that this God, this religion, is complexity. Like when that's my some of my friends and I are starting our own asifal, which we call the Cock, the Church of Complexity, not to be confused with anything else, but the Cock, the Church of Complexity, yes, represented by the rooster from Robin Hood. But yeah, so that basically that complexity is a perfectly worthwhile thing to worship, because it satisfies all of these conditions. It is, in fact, a demonstrable property of the world that gives it its uncertainty, but also its enormous generative capacity for growth. And that if we're going to try and further anything in epistemically and ontologically and creatively, I think that complexity is a pretty good one that we can, that not only can we mostly, I think, agree on shared terms, but it's one that can take many forms by definition. So it encompasses also ontological pluralism. A church of complexity would encompass many ways of furthering that complexity, because that is the only actual way to apprehend the elephant, if we're all these blind men apprehending the elephant. And so I would argue that I would make a call for this new sacred conspiracy, that what we should further, what we should seek, is complexity. And I think this extends even to our beliefs. I'm currently, one of my institutes is currently embarking on this whole project called Compassionate Complexity. And the notion is, can we design interventions using things like aesthetic chills and other forms of technodelics largely, but we're open to psychedelics too, to engender as the outcome measure complexity in belief, and even complexity in neural signaling, which it turns out that increases in neural signaling complexity can be related to belief updating and belief change. It's a common measure associated with psychedelics. So it seems like this is like, it's not just metaphorical. There is something to the growing and the cultivating and the furthering of complexity that is worthwhile epistemically and ontologically, and I think can form the basis for a ontologically pluralistic religion, again, grounded on information theory. So, yeah, thanks, guys.
I'm going to moderate, but I'm also going to ask the first question. Okay, and maybe this just all turns on like your particular view
Absolutely.
Of empowerment.
Yeah.
But I thought that it was like an overly optimistic view of trust and how like trust like tends to function or something like that. So and like I'm extremely sympathetic to this idea that our relationships, right, like they expand our selfhood, right? So like then we're like I'm a hyper agent, me and my friends, my closest friends or something like that. Okay, I trust them.
And and civil society. I mean, all of if you walk around for like a week and think about how each of the systems you function in could function with, if there were zero trust, you will find all the natural world is undergirded by tremendous levels of it. It's we notice when it deviates, but actually trust is like, it undergirds the world.
Well, so I agree that like hyper agency or like what you're calling hyper agency, like I think that like sure that incorporates like the different organisms I'm interacting with or the institutions or whatever, like beyond just my closest friends. But okay, so on your view, trust expands our power. Like trust allows us to like further our empowerment, right? Like we have this joint estimation, we have the estimation of joint empowerment. That's what trust is. And we put our trust sometimes in people.
Yes, when successfully allocated, right? Trust is the estimation.
But that's a
of that
big
expansion.
but.
It's a huge but.
Right.
Well, it's why the entire natural world spends such an inordinate amount of energy on figuring out who and what to trust and when. It's the main thing that social animals do. Because the most dangerous thing
is just bringing someone like when it comes to at least what Nietzsche means by empowerment, it's like growing in our ability to achieve our aims and our goals and so on, right? So like if I trust someone, I estimate that we're going to like jointly empower each other. But that person undermines my aims in some way. Like, and trust makes that when it comes to like relationships, I'm just like trying to test what you're saying against the real world and like this sort of like very.
Well, I didn't make a normative
trust.
claim about trust. Trust is the estimation of that, and when allocated successfully, it does expand, and it is the anticipation of that expansion. But it can by necessity be betrayed. It is the potential to expand state space beyond what is individual attainably, but it is inherently a priori undergirded by greater vulnerability to risk.
As long as it is the kind of thing that expands empowerment.
No. Trust expands empowerment as long as it is successfully allocated, but it includes.
But what is successful allocation?
One that expands empowerment.
Do you see what's so?
No, things only appear circular if you're not accounting for time. If I decide to allocate trust in you, I'm estimating that you are going to fulfill that trust, and if you in fact do, then my trust estimation was appropriately allocated. If you do not, then it was not.
Okay.
See what I mean? It's enacted. It's a dialectical process over time of essentially increased vulnerability and then increased reciprocation. Increased vulnerability and increased reciprocation. To trust more is to be more vulnerable. It's this constant not battle. It's this risk we always take. But if you don't trust anything, you will be very, very limited. But yes, you will never be disappointed. But if you trust a lot, you have the potential for very high increase of the state space you can accompany. But yes, you are subjecting yourself to the greater vulnerability of betrayal. And those two are tied eternally. There's no getting around it. So it's always a bet. It's not a sure strategy. But I would argue
it's not just
Trust me, bro.
betrayal.
I would argue that it's an
That's the
an
risk.
optimal strategy.
It's not just betrayal; it's the risk. I mean, it's the risk is that like if you're thinking of empowerment as and maybe I'm like missing the point, and then I'll go on to Matt anyway. But the risk is that you will trust someone. And that like they might never betray you, right? I don't know, like
Sure.
and I trust them, but they're harmful. And they can undermine my capacity for growth, and they can get in the way of my aims. And then they're not. Then like even if they don't betray me, then trusting them is not empowering me.
Well, that was not well allocated trust, right? It diminished your empowerment.
Okay, Matt.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of on the same topic, but just thinking about the nature in which trust successfully allocated would expand the self. And I'm wondering if that just needs to be worked out a little bit more kind of conceptually, because if I do that in relation to the other person, I assume that their self would expand as well. And so sometimes, at least when you're speaking, I don't know if it's conceptually or just the way it's describing, sometimes it sounds like to me that when I trust someone else and my self expands, like that they're being kind of sucked into myself such that they're now part of me. Of course, if you then flip it around and say, well, no, they also expand their self through the trusting relationship. Now I'm sucked into them, and you're kind of like, well, whose self are we doing?
I think something that I'm purposely not explicit about, because I want to avoid. Maybe I should be explicit about it because I want to avoid the trust is often, when said, is often given a positive connotation. Like that it's that like trust is just this nice warm good thing, and I would argue that when viewed in this fashion, it's actually it's very mixed, because you are forming part of a hyper agent, right? But that by definition is
something over and above.
There's exactly, we're forming something over and above, and that over and above may in the long term actually may act contrary to this former non-hyper self that I was before I entered in that relationship.
Fair enough. And so here's
Absolutely.
the thinker, and Dulcinea just ran off, but not to blame her, but I was
Not to blame her. How dare she run? How
I
dare
didn't
she
mean to say it like
go?
that, but I had the same thought that something that she mentioned last night about God being in the space between individuals who relate in certain ways. I think it was something along those lines. The thinker that I just think of here is Hegel, at least on a certain understanding, which is, what is spirit, and we have the phenomenology of spirit, and the spirit's kind of unfolding over time. at the end, it's the I that is the we and the we that is the I. Of course, there's tricky things where certain interpretations of Hegel, where the I just gets swallowed into the we, and then people like Karl Popper think that's awful. But there's an attempt there to like both be a self and then form a kind of hyper self that you're talking about, and saying that just is God on earth.
Yes.
Right. Having that connection between kind of two agents that kind of come together and form that kind of bond.
Absolutely.
And that's just the sounds like you kind of, that's kind of what's going on. And so I don't swallow
Absolutely.
up another person into myself, such that they're now functions of me. I don't get
you
swallowed up
guys,
by them.
you both
But
form
there is
something.
There is like a collective self that then emerges from the relationship.
And you could argue that when there's huge difference, when there's huge asymmetries of agency prior to that potential forming of the hyperagent, then whichever part of that has greater agency, there's a greater incumbent. It's more incumbent on the one that the trustee that has less agency to determine alignment on the part of the one that has greater agency. Like if I ally with a very powerful politician and businessman towards some joint venture, I have to be by that same proportion much more assured of their alignment and values in the, let's say, because there's suddenly greatly expanding joint state space afforded to both of us, but it's expanding so much that I need great assurance that it's going to still have a shape that excludes areas that I don't want to be part of, or ones that will preclude my empowerment. Whereas if it's a more symmetrical one, I think this is why people sometimes often prefer relationships in which there is some symmetry of agency. Then you get it's sort of hedging against the need for such an extreme level of alignment. And why, conversely, if you form a trust relationship with something that has very little agency, then you don't need to be less as assured of their alignment, because the proportion of agency that you're contributing to the hyperagent is much larger. It's going to be much closer to your priorities, what they were before you became this hyperagentic sort of composite.
Well, why don't we?
This is
Okay, go ahead.
This is meant to be a hand.
Okay.
It just has to do with
I don't care.
conception of power.
Sure.
So how would you say if somebody came along, just imagine a potential concern that, well, once you start talking power and empowerment, some of that sounds good, but sometimes when you talk power, that becomes like a zero-sum game. Like empowering some people means disempowering others, because there's only so much power to go around. We can't expand the total amount of power in the universe, and so if some people have more of it-
I would disagree with that.
Yeah, so how would you respond to that?
Well, because I think that's
Misunderstanding.
it's misunderstanding power as a quantity the way like energy is. Like I would agree, like energy is it's a fixed quantity. You can't make more, you can't make less. Power is almost a relational proportions. You could imagine some feasible upper end where sort of, some upper end where everything had coalesced into some giant Hegelian super agent that is able to inhabit any conceivable state, and that it's all become one thing. That would be maybe this feasible upper end on power. But between here and there, power is something that it's very hard to anticipate the extent to which it can multiply when aggregated between two agents. Like I think generally speaking, when two agents coordinate, the amount of agency they now possess is greater than the sum of the parts, almost as a rule.
Yes.
Not always, but generally speaking, that is almost always the case. But again, it's that doesn't mean that the values and states afforded by that hyperagent are going to be consistent with the one of the subagent. That's almost a necessary trade-off that happens when agents form part of hyperagents. Like you can see across the natural world, and like in cells in a body, for example, it's often been questioned, why do cells have apoptosis? Or why do animals in the animal kingdom tend to have lifespans that are not actually dictated that much by any necessity of physiology? There are things you could tweak about a lot of animals that would extend their lifespans very highly. But it seems to be that in an instance where there is some sort of hyperagent that is going to be perpetuating, it almost requires that the agency and the time horizon of its subagents be finite. Because there will almost inevitably come some point where the finite agency either becomes parasitic or undermines or in some way runs counter to that of the hyperagent. So to become of something greater, you do have to allow, in fact, for the fact that you may end and you are subsumed. I think that's part of what happens in a relationship. If you really commit to a relationship, you're understanding that like you're not going to satisfy every single one of your priorities and values as you saw them when you were just an individual person, but you're giving some of that up in order to inhabit a much wider array of state space together. But that is I don't blame people when they don't want to commit to that, because you are losing the self that existed before that to some extent, and that's just how it goes.